Hello and welcome to this panel session on unlocking the partnership between government and the real estate sector as part of the Reimagining Real Estate Sustainability Summit 2020. The Sustainability Summit is the first ever global virtual event devoted to real estate sustainability, health and wellness. It's organised by CREtech and co-chaired by the British Property Federation and the UK Green Building Council. I'm Melanie Leach and I'm Chief Executive of the British Property Federation, and I'm delighted to be joined for this panel by David Partridge, Senior Partner of Argent LLP, Chairman of Argent Related and President of the BPF, Maddie McDougall, Managing Director, Head of Real Estate and Housing at Lloyds, and Emma Mackenzie, Head of Asset Management and ESG at New River Retail. Welcome to all of you, and I'm going to start by asking each of you to give us your opening shot. Give us your respective businesses' approach to sustainability and climate risk, which we're then going to unlock in the panel session. But David, perhaps I could come to you first.
Well, thanks very much. I'm here also as potentially, I guess, as a trustee of the UK GBC. So I have many vested interests in this particular subject. I've just handed over the chairmanship of that to a colleague of mine, Sunand Prasad. And I think that in terms of thinking through what impact climate change is going to have on us over the next few months in a post-COVID world, and indeed critically over the next few years, the UK GBC and indeed the real estate industry as a whole have been working for many years trying to ensure that climate change sort of got back onto the agenda. And in my early years as the chair of the trustees, we sort of felt we weren't exactly a lone voice, but we certainly felt that we were perhaps slightly crying in the wilderness. The GFC completely threw off course any momentum that had been built up during the first decade of this century around climate change. The Cameron government promised all sorts of things to us in those days, and then they all went by the wayside. And we've seen, despite building up Paris and other commitments, we've seen the States turning away from this, Argentina and other big global politicians turning away. And what COVID-19 has done is actually proved to us just how important this is. And we really only have a few years to act. And so it's absolutely vital now that the whole industry gets together with, frankly, the rest of the world and other industries to take this incredibly seriously. And while one doesn't want to think of COVID as having silver linings, because there are all sorts of other issues which are going to be hugely impactful, let's at least make sure that we take advantage of the need to completely reconstruct our economies, and indeed in many people's cases our actual very businesses, to take on board the impact of climate change, social change, and with it the kind of governance bit that comes with the third bit of ESG. So I'm hugely supportive of this, and we've been doing it for many years, and looking forward to working with the rest of the industry, and indeed listening, hearing from the rest of the panel and the people that they represent as to how we can all work on this together.
Thanks, David. And we're going to hear much more about what Argent's been doing in detail a little bit later on in the panel. But Emma, can I come to you next?
Yes, good morning, or so good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me on the panel. From New River's perspective, our approach to ESG is very much holistic. It's embedded throughout the whole business, and we've worked very hard over the last few years to really integrate it into the decision-making process and have it much more holistic in terms of the operational side of the business, from not only an environmental perspective, but a social side as well. And we've definitely recognised that there's, particularly in the last few months, that the awareness of ESG and environmental impact and social impact has very much increased, and that certainly was the trajectory of that was the direction of travel long before COVID. It's been much more apparent in the last 2 to 3 years, the interest from shareholders and investors and stakeholders about what we are doing as a business to impact not only our environmental impact but our social impact. and that's that increase of awareness is very much an advantage. It's definitely something that we are capitalising on to gain more input from all our stakeholders because of the awareness and the interest in trying to effect change. Because I think the messaging from government and from businesses is very much that we all do have to do something to try and actually affect some change, and it's all little bits all add up to a lot. And from our perspective, managing our risks is very important. So our kind of principal risks are flood risk and also the managing the legislative risks, and that's all our kind of EPCs and affecting change in the operational side. So from our perspective, we welcome the raised awareness. I think it's very important as an industry we embrace it and actually try and make some positive change. And what we as a business are doing is just trying to understand what more we can do to try and affect the environmental changes, because one of our challenges is the age of our stock, because our shopping centres and retail parks are not new build, and it's how we go about making those environmental changes whilst still maintain the viability and the economic perspectives of actually affecting environmental change. But because we're regionally based, and we're a physical asset in town centres and communities, and that certainly has been a huge emphasis on community in the last few months. And also the whole social side of it is something we're very privileged to be part of, make a difference in the communities that we actually operate in.
Thank you. There's a couple of things in what you said that particularly struck me, and we'll come back to. One around sort of the influencing factors, whether it's customers, other stakeholders, government, or investors, and who's really driving this agenda. And I'll be really fascinated to pick up that some more. And then the other one is just that issue around the contribution to local communities and just making sure that we are making a positive impact and not just doing no harm, which is, I think, also coming through more and more strongly. But before we unpack some of that, Maddie, over to you.
Well, sustainability is something I'm incredibly passionate about. And actually, I studied a little bit of it at university. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, given I'm probably way out of date now. But I agree with David. COVID-19 is obviously the most immediate challenge at the moment, and a lot of countries are grappling with both the sort of human tragedy, but also the financial fallout that COVID-19 is going to play. But what we do know is climate change remains one of the biggest issues that we're facing today, not just in the UK, but globally. As you know, Lloyds Bank's very much UK focused, but as it's a primary risk for the world and for the UK, it's obviously a primary risk and a primary focus for Lloyds Bank. And we are very keen and passionate to try and help our clients transition to a low carbon future. It's central to our purpose, and our CEO signed the business leaders letters to the MPs supporting the green recovery. But we've also committed to reduce the carbon we finance by 50% by 2030. It's been a really interesting period, hasn't it? I think COVID-19 has taught us that there's a sort of an importance of shared purpose, collective action. Businesses have been applauded for pivoting activities to support communal effort. And consumers, actually, we've seen they want businesses to act responsibly, whether it's looking at their workforce, customers, community, and environment. So businesses are looking at what they can do to accelerate their efforts. I think COVID's the immediate effort, but how do we face into the medium and longer term efforts to be sustainable and to minimize climate change? So what are we doing as Lloyds Bank? You'll be unsurprised to hear we have quite a broad strategy across many parts of our business. But it recognises that we're in a unique position within the UK economy, and that makes us well placed to support our customers and manage both the opportunities, which there are some that are posed by climate change, but also to align with the ambitions of the Paris Agreement and the UK government's clean growth strategy. So our goal is to be a leader in the UK to help transition to a sustainable low carbon economy. And we set very clear ambitions anchored in the clean growth strategy as discussed. So to meet that commitment, we've got a four-pronged approach. So it's taking a strategic approach with new opportunities to support customers, clients, and finance the UK's transition. It's also about identifying and managing material sustainability and climate change risks across the group, of which there are many, and the impacts on the group and its financial planning in line with TCFD recommendations. We want to use our scale and our reach to help drive that progress towards a sustainable and resilient UK economy, environment and society. But also we want to embed sustainability into the way we do business ourselves and our own operations. So that's the sort of overarching strategy. I have really been trying to push real estate even further because, as we know, real estate contributes, I think it's 40% of all the carbon output. So what have we been doing? So we've been supporting the sector retrofit. So what we want to now do is pivot from where we were, which was the Green Lending Initiative, and I'm sure we'll come on and talk about that a little bit later. But how do we face into the new world as things are changing more and more quickly? So we wanted to pivot to the retrofit challenge. And what we want to do is provide 100% financing of retrofit with no arrangement fee. So in order to do this, we've signed a contract with CFP, which are green buildings company from the Netherlands. I think the Netherlands and the UK are leading the way in this sphere, and we're really trying to learn from other countries. I think that's the other thing that COVID-19's taught us, which is if other countries are experiencing things earlier, we should try and learn as much as we can from them. So this tool is a sort of instant assessment of a business case to retrofit a building that we've designed with CFP. So we love it because our customers get access to it. They can understand the risks in their portfolios, but also, you know, from our perspective, our risk colleagues will be able to understand the collateral that we have on our books and understand the risks that takes, or the investment that portfolio needs to be able to ensure that the EPCs that are now part of regulation are met across those portfolios. So that's the retrofit. Also, we want to help develop net zero and truly sustainable buildings. Now, you should argue that, and I'm sure David will tell us, when you develop new buildings, they should be pretty much close to net zero and sustainable as they are. But we want to continue to support that by providing discounted financing. So that was originally part of our Green Lending Initiative. Now, you could argue that we shouldn't have to give discounted financing to encourage people to do this, but I think it really has broadened the horizon and the clients that we can talk to. And once we've done that, it proves, and I very much think, you know, with all these things, you have to prove behaviourally how those buildings are occupied. It's not just about building them, it's who occupies them, how they use them, how the energy is used. So the data we can get through supporting those transactions are really key. And lastly, we want to support leading companies. So, you know, Emma and David definitely up there and loving hearing what you guys are doing, but, you know, there's companies that are willing to commit to facing into what climate change means for them, and to look at sustainability will inevitably end up as the leading companies and gaining the cheaper financing. And when I say cheaper financing, we often talk about a green discount, but actually it might move in a different way, and that you might get a brown margin rather than a deep green discount. So, you know, this is all to play for and all up for debate and discussion, but happy to discuss further as we go along.
Thanks, Maddie. And you touched on something else that I'm really interested in, which is the sort of on the one hand, the challenges of retrofit and the fact that, you know, a huge proportion of the real estate that will be here in 2050, by which time we're aiming for net zero, you know, is already built. And as opposed to the opportunities of new builds. So Emma, I'm going to come back to you and ask you just to tell us a little bit more about the challenges of dealing with an established and indeed in quite often an aging estate, which you touched on. And I know Europe has made, you know, huge strides in helping that to be more energy efficient, more waste efficient. So talk to me a little bit more about that, and then David, I'll come to you to contrast that with a new build story, if I may. But Emma.
So one way we're trying to encourage more cooperation with our occupiers is the use of our leasing structure, where we have a sustainability clause, which we have had for some years, but actually making more of it, mandatory with what we'd like to try and achieve. But it's giving people, an option whether they can potentially have an incentive to engage with us and take on a green lease, where effectively they're actually signing up to using renewable energy and sharing their data with us, because we have produced and have an occupier's guide, which is an education piece, because we have large retailers and small retailers, and we need everybody's buy-in to effect some change.
And David, you've been involved in some massive projects over many years, and you have the opportunity to set the blueprint for yourselves if you're thinking about new build and creating new places and new environments. Is that easier, or is that just a different set of challenges?
Well, I mean, arguably, it is easier because the retrofit issue is absolutely massive, and the economics around retrofit are huge. When you're building new, you do have the opportunity to build all of this in from scratch. And so, for instance, at King's Cross, and in our next new project, which is at Brent Cross, we've been able to build in a district-wide system, which allows at King's Cross for 100% of the hot water which services the entire estate to be delivered from a central point. That is through a series of combined heat and power engines, which deliver around actually generate about 80% of the electricity. The hot water is generated as a result of the electricity, so it's the waste that then gets pumped around the estate. And for about 25% of the estate, we've been able to convert that into coolant as well. So there is central air conditioning that's effectively applied to the north-west corner of the whole of King's Cross. So that allows for incredibly low carbon heating and cooling in those areas, and it allows the buildings themselves to then really focus on electricity as the main area where they might be generating carbon. And the truth is that where the UK is going now is that we could, within the next 10 years or so, and hopefully really rather quicker, have completely decarbonized the electricity grid. We're so far ahead in terms of our renewables, alongside the Dutch, as Maddie says, in terms of offshore wind and other renewables. And so it is possible to imagine a world where actually most of our energy, I mean, obviously this is before we all start driving electric cars, and we have to sort of quadruple the amount of electricity that's going to be delivered in the first place. But most of our energy in use could end up being pretty renewable. And then we turn to embodied carbon. And that brings us back to A, retrofit, and B, new. And I think that's actually where the debate is going to begin to start. Well, certainly it's not even a debate. It's where most developers and people on the kind of supply side of the equation are beginning to start thinking. It's like, how can I reduce the embodied carbon in my buildings and in my anything that I do? Or if I am going to have to do it, what do I have to do to offset it, or to ensure that I end up at net zero one way or another? And that's where the UK GBC and a lot of other consultants who are in this, the engineers, are already beginning to start thinking about incorporating more timber into our developments, incorporating much lower carbon concrete, thinking about how we can introduce a circular economy so that it sort of says that once you've actually used that carbon, you only use it once. You don't just then go and throw it away in 10 or 15 years time because buildings have to be repurposed. So there's actually already been an acceleration in thinking. And I think 2030 to be net zero in use is very, very achievable. Net zero in embodied is going to be much harder. And I think that's where we need to begin to start moving the conversation over the next few years.
And who's really going to drive that? Who's been driving the progress we've made to date? And who's going to drive that conversation and tackle those really, really hard issues? Is it government? Is it investors? Is it lenders like Maddie and finance people using their power? Is it customers? Is it going to be demanded of everybody, as Emma was talking about? Who's really going to drive that?
I genuinely, I think it's a combination of all of them. We should come back to Maddie in a second. I think it's a combination of all of them. I think our customers are demanding it. Our staff are demanding it. our occupiers' staff are demanding it. And as a result of that, legislation is kind of almost catching up, to be honest, although I have to say that a lot of the early work at King's Cross came about through our Section 106 obligations with the borough, where we were very happy to sign up to quite stringent targets. The target being we were always going to be X% better than normal. It didn't actually tell you how, but it told you where to go. And I think finance and investors, Maddie's talked about green loans and other things. Investors are going to be absolutely demanding this because they can see the same demands coming to them from the people who are putting, either legislating or, providing with them with their funds in the first place. So I'm with Maddie. I actually think we shouldn't be getting discounts for this. We should just not be given the money in the first place if we don't actually comply with it. So that seems to be the best way to provide the stick alongside the carrot.
Yeah, Maddie, you've got a fantastically powerful position there. But how do you see what you can do as opposed to what government and regulation needs to do?
Well, I think, if we had the time that we needed, we could all probably debate how it should happen, but we're definitely running out of time. There's no doubt about it. So we need to move quickly. And I think that's why no one actor in this piece can rely on someone else to do it. Everyone has to do their bit and have to do it quickly. And if you talk to people who are sort of at the leading edge of sustainability, they call it a super wicked problem, which I think is quite a cool way of putting it. And that is, time is running out. There's no one authority that can take this forward. It has to be everyone together in different guises. Sometimes the people who are causing the problems are also the people that are being tasked with solving the problem, which is another hurdle to jump through. And no one quite knows how to value sort of and efficiently price the future, if that makes sense. So that's the sort of super wicked problem that we face into. I think, working alongside, working in an organisation as big as Lloyd's, as David said, our staff expect it and demand it now. They'll vote with their feet. They won't want to work with a company that doesn't take it seriously and hasn't got it as one of their priorities. Our clients won't want to do business with us unless we want to do that. And we won't, there will be a point at which you have to say, I'm sorry, unless you have a sustainability strategy, we will not do business with you as a client. And I think that pivot point is actually coming now. We're very much talking about saying, what is your strategy? And if you don't have one, how can we help you develop one? So that's what the green building tools that we've just launched is. And what we found is, obviously larger companies who have the resources to be able to have a sustainability team are really able to face into this. But we finance very small companies up to the very large companies. And it's the smaller companies that are sort of have the desire to do something, but don't really know where to start. And so we have to help them understand what the sort of opportunities, what the risks are, how we drive forward. But I also think, although government and policy is incredibly important, and when policy is implemented, and not just in the UK, but using Netherlands as an example again, it really moves the needle very quickly. The government also need the private sector's help. So what I mean by that is, government policy is really easy to set if the private sector have been brave enough to start showing the way and showing what happens when you lead the way. And one example of that is, what we're doing in the banking world is to say that we will provide discounted financing for those assets that we believe to be more sustainable, have less obsolescent risk. And we can't prove it exactly today, but we know that in 5 to 10 years time, we can prove that that is better collateral and therefore should be lower risk weighted. And therefore the government or our regulators or whoever it is can actually say, well, we have evidence and therefore we can start setting policy around it. So it has to be a combination of, consumers, our colleagues, the private sector, the public sector. It's as I say, time is running out. So it really needs everyone to try and face in the same direction on this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Emma, you talked about using your power with your suppliers and your partners to drive, through the leases and so on, and the clauses that you put into your contracts. What are the pressures on you? What is it that most weighs with you as a business when you're thinking about your approach? Is it investors? Is it government? Is it?
Again, it's from every angle. It's coming at you, whether it's shareholders, our investors, our customers, our staff. The awareness of it and the willingness to engage is tangible. And I think that's a positive thing. So capturing that and harnessing and being able to deliver with people round about you, because you can't do this on your own. You have to engage with everybody to try and affect change. But I think the education piece is a big part of it, because the more people understand what they can contribute, the more they're likely to do so. But I also do think that the listed sector is different in that we have to demonstrate and produce our results, and we're all benchmarked and measured, etc. But I think government could put more of an emphasis on the private sector that don't have to report and don't have to divulge what they're doing in this area, because the listed sector of property ownership is it's a very small part of the sector as a whole, and hence the banking industry, who's lending to both private and listed, has a very significant and important role to play in driving change and getting buy-in from those that can sit below the radar. And I'm sure there's lots of good stuff going on below the radar, but I think what gets measured gets done. So for all we have to disclose it, it's probably a good thing if it extends further into the private sector.
Thank you. What's been really striking about this conversation so far is that we've talked almost entirely without really bringing in the context of the last 6 months and the impact of COVID. We've just stayed really focused on the big picture, which is fantastic. But I have to ask each of you, the pressures of the last few months and the impact that COVID's had, and of course, Emma, particularly in retail. I mean, retail was already going through evolution; it was being painful, and that's been really driven much harder and faster by the impact of lockdowns and COVID and so on. So, how have we managed to talk for 20 minutes or so already, and really not that hasn't featured? Has that really had no impact? Has that not wavered your commitment or forced you to make different decisions at all?
Well, I think in terms of on the kind of climate side, of the environmental aspect of our sustainability, it hasn't really changed in the last few months, purely because that's such a long-term play. Really, it's about understanding where we are, where we have to get to, and how we affect that change. So that's been just been ticking on as we were doing at the beginning of the year. We're just progressing along the same lines as we were at the beginning of all this, but. What it has impacted is very much on the social side, and as a business, we're fortunate enough to partner with the Trussell Trust, which is the national support to food banks, and it's positively eye-watering when you read the statistics in terms of the use of food banks in the last 6 months. It's really frightening. So for us as part of communities and the social side, the impact of the last 6 months has been very tangible, but on the environmental side, it's very much driving on and business as normal, and hoping that that we can continue on the path that we were, which is understanding how we get to net zero as quick as possible.
David.
I mean, I absolutely agree that the social side is the thing where perhaps it has had most impact. What we're seeing is much greater focus on neighborhoods, on localities. People are less interested in getting in on public transport. I mean, that has its own impacts on places like the centre of London and some of the centres of the bigger cities. But it is quite, not surprisingly, people are focusing more on their high streets and what's going on down the road, and that in itself is allowing a greater emphasis on community, on local goods, on kind of recycling of materials and activity, and so on and so forth. So I think that is one thing that we will all, well, a lot of us have been doing it for many years, as you say, but I think generally society has kind of realized that it's not quite so capable of just sort of jumping from one place to the next, and it makes a lot of sense to get to know your roots and to get to know your community, because you can spend, people discover that they both have to and can spend a lot of time quite close to where they live and where they work. I think the bigger impact, which is going to be something which I think hasn't come through yet, because most of the time we're all sort of living generally pretty much day to day, kind of looking at the statistics and wondering what impact it's going to have on our business at the next quarter day or whatever it happens to be, is that what COVID has shown is that a disaster, and I mean that in inverted commas, in the same way as climate impact can be a disaster with a capital D, a global disaster, actually has resulted in a complete re-rating of a whole bunch of businesses and the way things have happened. Emma, retail has had issues. So has, look at travel. Look at airplanes. Look at Rolls-Royce. All the impacts of all of those things. If climate change ends up being as disastrous and having the same impact, it's going to completely re-rate a whole bunch of businesses. Mm-hmm. And what was really interesting is I attended a session, the Bank of England, and I can't remember the guy's name, but they are putting forward these various different climate change scenarios, from really bad 4 or 5 degrees to can we keep below 1.5 to 2, and they're actually asking both countries and indeed major businesses to say, in those circumstances, what would your business be worth? Have you been able to, adjust for the risk of that eventuality? And if that means that you're a petroleum company and your business is worth 0, should we be factoring that into your valuation today? Now, obviously, that then has impact on real estate, because we're all in the real estate, and you really start saying to yourself, well, if in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, I've been working on a yield of X% and a YP of 25 or whatever it is. Well, if in 25 years, that building is not just worth 0, it's worth minus X, you can't say that today's value is whatever it is. Paddy, this is going to hit absolutely everything, isn't it? The valuers are going to have to work this out. The banks are going to have to work this out. The public markets are going to have to work this out. And the true cost of not being environmentally or socially aware and building it into your business plans just is not reflected. And what COVID has done is shown that a whole bunch of businesses never understood the true cost of a pandemic. So, I know I'm being quite circular, but in effect, it's the same issue that we're going to face. And we can't pretend it's never going to happen to us, because it has. And we all know that the science is telling us that climate change and some social change as well is going to hit us too. So let's start factoring that in now. And if we do that, we will end up spending paying much more attention, and indeed devoting much more resources, because the net present value of not doing that is so catastrophic potentially for some of us. So I do think that's kind of coming down the track, and that goes beyond the sort of touchy-feely piece of sort of my customers want it and and all the rest of it. Yeah. They want it for good reasons, but this hits the hard economics of, am I really a sustainable business in the true sense of a business that's going to be around in 20 years' time, in order to be able to continue my license to operate effectively.
Yeah, Maddie, I see you nodding vigorously there.
I know, I just want to echo David's points. I think what it showed, firstly, obviously, through the last 6 months or however long it's been now, obviously we've been there to support our clients. That's been our primary role, as they've all gone through some pretty challenging times, as we have ourselves. We have a lot of our colleagues working in branch networks that are needed in communities. And so we've had people who've had to sort of still continue to go into work during this time. But, where I really feel that what has happened is we have, whatever they say about we've had plans for pandemics and we've had pandemics before, it didn't feel like it was very orderly, did it? It was very disorderly in terms of what we had to do when, where we set up for it. And I think the one thing I've taken from it is I don't want to be in a stage where we do the same with climate change, where we put it off and off and off, and therefore it becomes a disorderly transition. We know we've got a transition. we hope we can do it in an orderly fashion. We hope we've left enough time to do it in an orderly fashion. And to those sort of scenario planning points, interestingly, you know, you've got to run those scenarios and say, what would we do in each scenario, depending on how quickly climate change happens to us. But, you know, it's the combination of what are the transition risks as we go through that, but also what is going to happen, sort of physical risks in the meantime. So, you know, we know that weather events are becoming more and more likely. You know, only sort of 2 days ago, I think in the Rockies, there was sort of 100 Fahrenheit heat, and then the next day it was snowing. We've got permafrost melting in Russia. And so these things are moving pretty quickly now, these feedback loops. And so I think what we need to face into is sort of how do we get through this in as orderly fashion as we can. We know that, you know, the oil and gas companies have had to write off significant amounts of their balance sheet because they are trying to transition to sort of green energy, but, you know, think of that value erosion. Just, you know, even 5 years ago, you couldn't quite contemplate how quickly that's come. So, you know, that movement, I think when these things happen, they happen quickly. And so we need to get on top of it. The other thing that I think is really interesting, and I did raise the other day, is it's going to become increasingly easy for companies, maybe, you know, like Lloyd's, to say that they've reached net zero when half their workforce work at home. So I've made it very clear that we can't just assume that because no one's going into the office, that, you know, our waste isn't as high as it is, our energy usage isn't as high. So how we transition and face into the fact that we also have people working from home is going to be very important. But absolutely, it's about disorderly versus orderly transition for me, and that's what we've learned over the last 6 months.
And Emma, I mean, for a business that, as you've described, is so embedded in local communities around the country, that orderly versus disorderly transition, you have to take people with you, and you want to take people with you. How are you tackling that challenge? How do you approach that as a business in terms of those challenges that David and Maddie have been talking about?
Well, I think first of all, being honest about the challenge that is there, you know, being showing our vulnerability in circumstances is a long way to getting people's buy-in to work with us. And certainly, in our building stock, as I said, is not new. We're not developers of new buildings. And hence that you know, that is a challenge. So I think you know, educating and explaining where we are and what our objectives are and why we're doing it gets buy-in, and even from our centre managers who are very much the face of what we do on site and the liaison with our retailers. You know, we've got a webinar with all of them tomorrow to just to kind of bring them up to date again as to where we are with our ESG and what we're trying to achieve and why. And then with our retailers, very much just getting our occupiers on board, and that, you know, the retailers, particularly at the moment, have got a whole raft of challenges that they're facing, but this isn't going to go away. And I think that's what's very different between this crisis and the financial crisis. You know, 2007, 2008 was that it was very much dropped like a bit of a hot potato at that stage, whereas this time it's tangible, the difference in the willingness to keep this on people's agendas and businesses' agendas, and that we all have to try and deliver some change in an orderly fashion, hopefully.
Yeah. Thank you. So we're coming to the end of the panel. So my last question to each of you in turn is going to be going back to one of the themes of this panel session, which was around the partnership between the industry and government. So do you think that the government is seized of the urgency and the need to act in some of the ways that you've described? And if you had a wish list, what's the thing that you'd like government to do to help to drive this agenda and to help you to drive the agenda in the different ways in which you can do it as businesses? Emma, I might come back to you first, if I may.
Well, I think I mean, one of the things certainly that we're aware of is because of the location of our assets and the local piece, is that one thing that's not ever taken into account is the transport emissions from people travelling to assets that are out of town and more difficult to get to, etc. Whereas most of our assets are walkable. You know, vast majority of our customers come on foot or by public transport, and that isn't factored into to the reporting of emissions, etc., and our carbon footprint, etc., which I think is a valid point. I do think government could do more in terms of supporting and providing finance and funding for the existing building stock. But it's the whole viability piece, and for us to be able to do the social aspect of our ESG programme, it's very much linked to the commercial side, because without the commercial side and the viability of the business being a business, we're not going to be able to deliver on the social side. So identifying what the gap is and actually getting some financial support, I think from government will be important, and also that it's potentially making it mandatory for occupiers of space to be able to share their data, and so that we can work more collaboratively as the owners and occupiers of space. I think that may be something that has to affect change, because there's a fairly wide spectrum of those that want to engage and work with you, and those that aren't, so it's not so high on their agenda. And as I said, it goes back to the visibility of private and public businesses, that if they don't have to do something about it, in some cases they don't feel the same sort of moral purpose to do it. So maybe it's something that has to come. And this again, that's as David said, lead with a carrot and beat with a stick. And I think environmental it needs both parts, to be honest, to make things happen.
Thank you, David.
Well, so I absolutely agree with all of that. I think the one area where perhaps is something that's maybe particular to the sorts of work that we do, I can see that the renewal and regeneration post-COVID, and indeed over the next 5-10 years in any case, is going to require an awful lot more cooperation between the public and private sector. It's the public sector that owns a lot of the land, whether it's a local authority or a big transport authority or hospital trusts or whatever. And if we're going to try and avoid building, within outside of our city centres and our brownfields, and maybe even into our suburbs, we're going to need to see public sector coming forward with much more land. We're going to need to see support from organisations like the Homes England and others who are pump priming all of this. And as part of that, there's the whole discussion about state aid, procurement, and how the public sector actually engages with private sector. And in the past, the key metric for public sector procurement has been around best value. They've got to be able to demonstrate that if they're going into a partnership with and we all want more partnership, because I think the combination of skills, money, land, et cetera, involves all aspects of everybody I've just been talking about. But the criteria around best value previously has been entirely down to financial returns. And what we need to see is a recasting to include environmental and social outcomes as part of best value, in order to be able to ensure that those elements are given appropriate emphasis as part of the outcomes of regeneration. So it's not just about generating enough land to be able to pay for a notional red book valuation enough money to pay for the notional red book valuation of the land. It's actually about all those other aspects. Is there enough affordable housing? How many jobs have you created? What are you doing for training and education in that area? How much, how many local businesses have you supported, et cetera, all those various different other things. I think it's easier to measure environmental improvements and environmental value for the reasons that we've talked about. We all understand carbon, and we understand, waste, and we understand water, and those metrics are easier. The social ones are much harder.
Much harder. So
coming alongside the valuation piece, there should be something around agreeing some common metrics, whether it's through the Green Book or whatever, however it's done, that we all know that what we do is having an equal impact, or an impact that at least can be measured in the same way as others, and that'll get us onto a level playing field. So I feel that's not a change that government has to. It's not going to involve X billion pounds of grant to build or whatever. It's actually quite a subtle rethinking of Treasury and other criteria, but actually the impact it could have on across the board, and I don't just mean obviously just in London, across the whole of the UK, that in itself could completely reset the dial for the way public and private sector come together to resolve this problem, and result in real positive outcomes on all those levels, which we all buy into, which we all intuitively know we should be doing, but we're not necessarily measuring them at the moment.
Thank you, David. And Maddie, last word to you.
So, you know, we discussed earlier about some of those countries stepping away from the Paris Agreement, and we spent a whole panel, we haven't mentioned Brexit, but I won't mention it that much. But in a post-Brexit world, what does the UK stand for? And I think one of the things that we can take on is we want to be one of the leaders, world leaders in sustainability. And I think the government needs to harness that, because we are right at the forefront of it as we stand, and we're hosting COP26. You know, I think that's a really good place for us to be, to try and drive some of these changes through. I think they're talking about having part of that as a sort of built environment day or built environment sessions. And I think the government, obviously working with the likes of the Green Buildings Council and the BPF, can really start to move the needle about sort of education and discussing some of the changes that need to happen. I think they need to be brave about setting policy. They shouldn't be shy about that. I know I talked earlier about the private sector helping them to understand that, but actually, you know, sometimes they can't wait, so they need to step up a little bit there. And then obviously my last ask would be for the regulators to really look at capital weighting of loans. You know, if you're lending to a company or assets that are sustainable and are good collateral in terms of the environment, you should have a lower capital weighting, or, you know, the reverse of that is if they're not, they should have a higher capital weighting. That's really where you can drive through change, and what we're trying to do at Lloyd's internally, but actually we need the whole market to be aligned to that. So that's sort of my final ask.
Fantastic, thank you. That's been a fabulous discussion. We could have gone on a lot longer, but thank you to David Partridge, to Emma McKenzie, and to Maddie McDougall. Thank you very much.